Hello everyone. I'm going to get started here on a collage, and I've laid out some materials with regard to using acrylic swatches. So I have this stack of, it's literally 8.5 by 11 printer paper, and it's covered with swatches of acrylic that have been scraped across it with a palette knife. And in some cases I've put a piece of texture underneath it, whether it's corrugated cardboard or something else that I've found that has a surface texture that's pretty interesting to scrape against. So I've got a range of saturations, and it's really a game of having enough material to work with and not relying on only a few small pieces to cut up for your whole picture. So I have a stack of that, and I've got a bunch laid around the studio with regard to texture piles. Here's a pile of gray, here's a pile of dark, here's a pile of more lighter tones, to just give yourself some sort of form of organization. I've got a pair of scissors, some permanent glue stick, an X-Acto knife, a pencil, tracing paper, cutting mat. I've got a blown up version of my thumbnail, and a slightly tighter version of the sketch. So with that, I'm going to get started, move some of the materials out of the way. Right now I need some tracing paper, just one piece, with the goal here about finding a shape that can be a surface to work upon, so a ground, if you will. So I've got this shadow shape that kind of holds things together. It's a mid-tone relationship. I've got it sketched out a little tighter. It's still relatively loose because I want to keep it a little more free form, but I'm going to go through and just sketch that on the tracing paper. I might put something down here too. I want to leave a little room to play and have some fun with it. And then I just need to, I need to know that it goes behind that figure. So I'm looking for the boundaries of it. Something loose, nothing too dramatic. You can see it there. And collage is a little bit of trial and error. I've got this big sheet of acrylic here. It's a mid-tone, kind of sandy color. And the tracing paper benefits me here that I can look for interesting textures within this, something that I like. All in mind of, it's got to be a mid-tone. But let's say the shadow from the figure's leg here could become part of the texture that I find in my cropped version. But it is a game of trial and error. So some things may work the first time and be perfect. Some you may have to find a new shape for it, cut it out again, try again. So literally, I'm going to stick it right there. So the tracing paper is going to be my guide, and I'm going to cut through that. So what I do is just take this down a couple spots. I've got a cutting mat here. Make sure you're cutting on the mat and not your board or your table. And I'm going to go through with the X-Acto knife. And again, cut safely, cut away from your fingers. So this top portion here I know is going to be relatively easy. I'm just going to cut a smooth curve, if you will, cutting away from my fingers. When I cut towards my body, move my hand. If you've lost your drawing in any of this process, then give yourself a little bit more room. You can freeform cut it if you need to. So make it a little bigger than it might need to be, and you can then adjust things as you see fit. Sharp X-Acto blade is certainly useful. Right here I haven't defined what I want to have happen yet, so I'm going to let it kind of go beyond. Maybe I'll tear into it. Maybe I'll cut back into it with another shape down the road. And I might, I think I'm going to tear that edge too, so I'm going to cut it a little bit wider. Here I'm looking at a shadow shape. It's going to fall over sand, so arcing and finding variety within it. So it may be something I finesse a little bit more again with the scissors. And back down. And so I should be pretty close to gotten all the way through. Sometimes the paper will need a second cut in a few spots. The benefit of the acrylic here is that it's plastic. I can remove this tape cleanly without worrying about it ripping the paper up. So if you're using watercolor paper, you want to be real careful there if you tape something down. And usually flipping this over so you can see the back will help you see what needs to be clipped out a little bit cleaner. And since I know areas here I'll have to use the scissors on anyway, this will give me a little bit where I can just pull that off. So I've got this shape now. Throw that down on the floor. Always nice to see it on white ground since I'm working towards a drawing that's going to use the white space. You can do it on a piece of Bristol or illustration board here as well, but when I'm laying things out, I don't want to dirty up the board. So I'm going to keep it on just another loose leaf piece. So either I'm going to look at this and say, that's about where I want it, right? Maybe I don't like that shape, and it may be something that I collage over or adjust. But I want to really pay attention to this edge and say, what needs to happen there? It may be that I don't do much to it yet till I see some other things develop around it. But I know there's a little white spot there that I didn't like too much. I was going to rip this edge, and so when you rip, you want to think about how you're ripping. Are you ripping this way, or are you ripping this way? Ripping this way will leave white on the edge, which you may or may not want. I think that's fine. Ripping this way will not give you a white edge. So again, I wasn't sure what I was going to do here, so I want to, sometimes when you got that shape that you really like and you don't know what to do with it, you just need to tear it. Give it a rip and you're going to find some accidental shape or mark in there that's going to be fun. So I've got this extra piece here that relates to this, so I'm not going to lose this. I want to keep that in a nice pile over off to the side. And now you can actually see this shape that I've just torn. So I'm going to use this as a template, essentially. The drawing is back and forth between bringing in a shape to cut over around it, as well as bringing in the tracing paper back into it to say, well, just keep moving around it. Say, I want this ice chest next. I may want to develop kind of a figure-ground relationship with it, where I don't want that edge. Maybe I want this to be pure white here. And so it's going to be about trial and error to define what edges, what sides really need to be collaged, and what can be the ground space that I collage around to make the figure. But I don't want to be too picky about this whole thing. Meaning, perspective can be a little fun and playful. It doesn't have to be perfect. Save these things. Sometimes it's helpful to write it on the back. Ground. Label it. Give it a good descriptor so that if you pile these up in an envelope in between sessions where you're working, you've got some semblance of how they went back together. And we're going to try time-lapse here to speed this whole process up a bit. Got this great texture that mimics the styrofoam ice chest, and I've quickly cut that out. I'm going to lay it on top of the ground, and it certainly has a value or brightness change with the ground, so I like that. Cutting out a side plane here to really explore the potential of light and shadow on the form to see if it's going to work. And with that attempt kind of experiment with, I wanted to take a look at the potential for the negative space or the ground to interact with the figure. So what does it look like if that front plane was actually white? At this point I'm still unsure. I think I prefer the look of just that very bright light color. And then I'm looking at the background. I've got this very abstract ground, not really indicative of anything in particular. It allows for some people to kind of read into the space, sort of out of focus, almost kind of like a glitch, digital glitch looking art. But I want that value. I want something dark. It's got the relationship of colors that are happening in the foreground. In small little ways, there's moments of high saturation, there's moments of dark, there's moments of grayed out browns. So there is that kind of connective tissue running from back to front. And I have that really strong diagonal in the background. You'll see that kind of point to something later on in the composition. And I'm moving to the umbrella. This is an area where I already know for sure that I want the negative space, the ground space, to be created by the collage around it, but in order to experiment with that and kind of find its location, I need to have that shape cut out as a piece of white paper so I don't ruin the background that I've already set up and cut into it before I know exactly where it's going to go. So here I'm looking at textures with this same surface underneath. So they line up as stripe patterns, and I've got a couple different values of it to mimic the multicolored kind of tops of an umbrella. And I'm kind of experimenting with the angle so that I get some perspective in there. It's not that these absolutely have to have realistic perspective, but for me it makes sense. For my piece it makes sense to utilize something a little more natural and show those angles receding away from you essentially. So that's what I'm kind of looking at. I put a pretty saturated orange underneath it that allows me to not care about it being a perfect fit, meaning those shapes don't have to line up like puzzle pieces exactly. They're close, but that little orange will be this moment of kind of interest and saturation peeking out underneath those moments of collage. So you can already kind of see that happening there. And then I've got a strip there for the pole with a nice little white line down the middle of it to give it a little dimension. And I'm always continuing to go back to this drawing, so it is absolutely essential that we have a clean, understood shape to work with as we're cutting these out, so that it leaves you no doubt about where that shape needs to start or end. And so that clarity is key as you're cutting out a hat. In this case, you can line up exactly where that tracing paper is going to go over top of a stripe and make sure that it happens where you want to on the shape. really the first moment where I'm going to consider gluing something down, because I think it works and I don't want to lose it. I want to really start to dive in and give it some permanence, but ultimately it's acrylic. I could snap that off without too much trouble if I needed to change the value of the hat or something. The beach ball, similar to what's happening with the umbrella, where I'm going to let that white space become part of the figure. I know I want to use closure on the shapes of the stripes and really reveal that form and figure without defining the whole circle. I want to have some play of white space into the figure. But I'm gluing these down to the just the plain white paper, the printer paper, a little larger than they need to be, and this is a great way to kind of introduce pattern or stripes to something, is lay the stripes down on something, and then here I am, I'm going to cut it out and really clean that thing up. So it's on a piece of white paper, but optically I know in the final result I'm going to want that white space to overlap with the ground and make sure that it kind of bleeds together. And so we're really going to just continue to move from shape to shape, cut things out, see what's working, make comparisons to other forms and figures that are in there. I found this great texture and pattern to indicate a tote bag of some kind with a little decoration to it. And I did a couple different values on it so that I would be able to do something like this and provide light and shadow on it. Change direction also implies a contour, cross contour to it. Gives a little more dimension and form. So two things working to develop that volume. And then it's just having some fun, playing with little shapes, cutting things out, trying them. That one doesn't work, so I'll find it again, try it again. And when you're happy with something, you glue it down. You can sort of have a little bit of remorse over cutting something too soon, I suppose, but nothing ventured, nothing gained. And the sooner you just make a piece happen and put it together, the sooner you realize that it works. It doesn't have to be perfect. I've got a light and shadow on it. I've got a volume to it. I'm starting to put forms in there. I've got a little box coming out of it that's got light, shadow, and dark on it. Immediately there's more dimension to it. So I'm going to glue it together and put it back in there. But this one took a little bit of figuring out what's going in there, because I didn't have a strong plan as to what are these things. I found this cool texture. I thought it could be anything. It could be a rolled up beach towel. It could be a yoga mat. I think there's toys that you can play with, like big long pool noodles that you can hit people with. That it could be something like that. I just want to indicate that there's some stuff that's been brought to the beach, and you can let the viewer fill in the blanks about what it is. So I was trying some other things in the back there, but it really ultimately just came down to needing a value. What's the dark behind all that to set it off and make sure it stands out? Gluing things down, I want to make sure that they're well secured. So you'll want to pick that piece up and hold it tight for a second or two to make sure that it's fully secured. One of the things you're lucky to have had me cut out of this video are all the moments where I'm just leafing through paper after paper after paper. Does this work? Does that work? Is this the right value? And so you're not really seeing all of that hesitation, if you will, the leafing through and piling through papers. So count yourself lucky for that. But it's going to be part of this. You're going to have to test something out. You're going to have to try it. You're going to have to move things around, like I'm moving that little piece as it overlaps the bag, whether or not I like the idea of the sand kind of piling up on the beach there. The testing, the trial and error. That's something inherent to collage making. sure I'm cutting out for the chair in the background, and because there's no right side edge that's super defined because the figure overlaps it, I just make sure to allow for enough room to glue something to. So whenever you've got that component that needs to be attached behind something, just make sure you leave enough room and you don't cut it flush to it. So you got to be thinking about what layering order you're going to do this all in. And you're going to see that develop on the body of the figure especially. Sometimes as you look at that skin tone that I've just cut out for the upper torso, you don't really know what it's going to look like until you put something else on top. So putting the bikini on top will make that a little easier to navigate, a little easier to kind of interpret and check out if it's working. Small little cuts here, and one of the straps gets cut off. I didn't lose it, so I was able to save it, and I don't think it becomes noticeable in the final piece as being disconnected anymore from it. But you do have to be really conscious of where you put the shapes that you're going to use, because that would have been an easy one to lose. And not that I couldn't have cut it out again, but it was the right shape. It was exactly what I needed. I didn't want to lose it. But now it all of a sudden kind of looks a little bit more like what you intend it to be. So in this whole process, I'm not creating one single body shape. I could have, but I didn't feel like I needed to because of so many subsequent divisions of the form with things going over top of them. I've got a book in the lap. I've got a crossbar from the chair going over top of the arm, and obviously the bikini top and the shorts go over the legs. They have so many spaces and parts where you can interrupt it and not have to have one single unified form. I also knew that the figure was going to be a little more in shadow on the torso, and the legs were going to kind of move out into the light source a bit more. So I didn't see a quick solution to show that in all one big piece. So it needed to be multiple pieces. The definition of the lights on that right leg as we're looking at it is just a shape. It's highlighting the knee, it's highlighting the division of light and shadow on the form. I elected not to do it on the other leg. It's got a little bit of a bright streak through the paint. I felt like that was enough, and I didn't need to overcomplicate it more than it was already. But it could certainly have taken one of those more solidified shapes if I wanted it to. And I'm not really even concerned, like the drawing doesn't have a back foot. When you're in the beach, you dig your feet into the sand, so I wasn't really too concerned about that. And I was thinking about maybe letting that go into shadow a little bit more underneath that front leg, so it could almost be hidden. Got a great gradient to that belly. It's a little warmer, it's a little less gray than the upper portion. I think ultimately that was something I was a little worried about, and could be something that necessitated a change to one of the shapes. But I just continued on until I got a little bit more going. I wasn't going to fully make a decision and cut 5 different variations out to see which one's right. Just keep moving. It definitely matches the leg, and so I was more concerned about what was happening on the upper portion of the body with it. Attaching the shorts over the legs, getting those to connect a little bit and see where it might read as a shadow from the book as well, if that would make sense, falling on the back leg. But when you're good with something, you glue it down and just keep moving. Because if you don't start gluing things down, you're going to lose all those pieces. And this is where I'm really kind of hedging my bets and saying, well, I've got that warm skin tone down below. What happens if I would create a plane, a light and shadow plane that would allow it to be warmed up on the top portion, but still maybe the arm is grayed out a little bit, rolling into the shadow. So I cut this piece out and tried it. I wasn't crazy about it. It made the face too bright. I wanted that face to be a little darker and more in shadow so it would stick out against the potential white ground behind it a little bit more. I'd already left the hair bright, and I was worried about those values blending together. Right, I'm gluing that light shape onto the mid-tone shape of the leg, and it doesn't lay perfectly because I can't cut a perfect edge, so once you've glued it, cut it with the scissors and clean that edge up so they're both sharing the same contour. Repeating stripe pattern with the bag. In this case now I've got a curvy line. It's the same texture that I used on the back of the seat, but I think in this context it looks relatively different, but still shares that similarity. And again, I've got light and shadow on it so that it gives us that opportunity to create a little form, even if, what is that really? It could be a pile of towels, could be a bag. Again, I'm looking for the viewer to potentially see a shape there and interpret it a little bit more. And experimenting now with the back of the seat, something slightly different. Went back to stripes like I had on the bag, cut off a component of the original one to serve as the steel kind of pole that goes through and attaches the fabric to the frame. Wasn't something I originally planned, but it was something I found in the textures that just made it so much more believable. And I'm creating the little bend at the top of the chair using my pencil to shade it under a little bit. Didn't find a good gradient that made sense, but the pencil was the right color. It was gray. Just gives it a little bit of form. So I don't do a ton of drawing in this, but that's one little moment where just a little shade helped to communicate a little bit more. So there's no reason why we can't go back in with colored pencil, even a little bit more paint if you needed to correct something, or there was a little hiccup in this scraping that happened there and left a little white spot. You might go in and paint it out. And you can really see that I'm using the original drawing as a template. I continue to plant the foot back into position and use that as kind of the keystone. And when I need to put a position together here, like the back arm, lay the arm over the drawing, position that foot back into position, and lay that whole body down over top of it so that the glue will adhere to it, and I get it in the right spot. So that drawing is a key component here. If I've got a good, clear path and template for everything, it makes the whole process really much smoother. And I can't understate the fact that a clean drawing will aid you so much in this whole process. Throughout this whole video, I hope you realize just how useful that piece of tracing paper will be. I'm being very economical with the tracing paper. I'm using up all the little scraps because so many of the little pieces are, less than an inch wide. You can get a lot out of one sheet of paper, and it just saves you so much time in terms of trying to redraw something. You've already drawn it. Just use that as a stencil to define something quick and easy. And so we're going to be moving a little quicker now to the really final preparation. I think for this point in the video, most of the pieces are put together, nearly, and so it's assembling it all together on the final surface. So I pulled the illustration board out, and I'm going to start with the ground, start with the background, establish its position on that space, establish any other tears or rips that I might need to do to kind of solidify it. So I'm gluing those together, and I'm going to reassemble this on that plain piece of paper because it doesn't have the grid underneath it, meaning my drawing. I've sort of got to locate it a little bit. So I've slid that drawing underneath so I can place the positioning of that umbrella and cut into that ground now. So this is me really committing to that idea. There's no going back. You'd be able to see the cut if I try to replace it. And a clean sheet of paper underneath that, if you can see that. My glue stick was drying out, so I had to get a different one. This is one of those ones that dries clear, but goes on purple. And just slap that piece down. That sets up the location of everything else in there. Try to give myself a good buffer around it, a nice little border. And just, this is the fun part. This is like putting the puzzle together now. So all the gluing is happening off screen. I bring it back in, ready to go, and just lay it down. Occasionally you start to slide it around a little bit while the glue's still wet, and you can get it into the right position. And just keep an eye on any corners that start to buckle up and lift up. You just knock a little glue stick underneath there and make sure it's good and secure. The benefit of the illustration board is it's not flexible. So if you bend a piece of Bristol and you've glued this stuff down, it's possible that some of those pieces could start to lift off a little bit more. The illustration board just gives you a nice, good, solid surface and substrate to build on. You can almost see it right now, like you could just photograph it and call it done, potentially. But we like to have a good piece of art here at the end as well. Useful. It's always something we can think about as an illustrator. If you're working traditionally, you have the potential to sell the rights to a client to use as an illustration in their magazine or on a product or whatnot, but you keep the original. You're not giving them the piece of art itself, and that becomes something you can sell to someone else. And you've hopefully kept the rights to use your artwork in other ways as well. You haven't given those completely away. And so you can potentially see a piece like this would be almost a little bit like stock art in terms of it being useful to a number of people, locations, places, and times. It really could be timeless in a way, that it doesn't become so tied to a particular idea or concept that a client is coming to you with, that you could sell this to a travel magazine, you could sell it to a local company who needs to put an ad in the newspaper. There's all kinds of potential. Once again, I've got a big shape. The big shapes go down first. They create the platform for everything else on top of it. I made little pencil notes here to make sure that my umbrella pole goes into the right spot, and then you just erase them out using a little piece of kneaded eraser. Locating my figure and the chair so there's not too many tangents, trying to avoid those as much as possible, weird connections with the pole and such. So there's a little bit of maneuvering back and forth, and I'm still not sure of its location yet, so I just have it on there with a piece of tape for the moment. Same thing with the beach ball. And really trying something new here. I had this piece cut out that I thought could work for a towel on the beach, and it ultimately does become that, but I was almost seeing it as one of those chairs that opens up into 3 components and folds out to support the legs as well. But I do eventually put it over there underneath the ice chest. Balances the stripes out, so the stripes are happening in little moments throughout. The stripes are never right on top of each other in terms of one shape right on top of another striped shape. So there's a gap between the umbrella, there's a gap between the ice chest and the blanket, there's a gap between the ice chest and the chair. The person is in the middle of the chair compared to that piece that I've just played in there. And then there's a nice white space between the bag. I'm looking at that ground behind the face and realizing that it's not enough contrast. So I'm throwing an audible and ultimately going to put a darker shape back there. And I'm just trying to figure out how big it needs to be. Is it going to be cut? Is it going to be torn? And ultimately I go with something a little smaller, because those are huge pieces right now. And I like those torn edges as a contrast to the sharper cut edges. It just promotes some variety, but in no way does it mean any collage has to have both. You know, you could make a really clean-cut collage with no torn edges. You could make a collage with only torn edges. It just depends on what your aesthetic is and how it fits your subject matter. Here's another moment where I think you allow the viewer to make some calls. Is that something that's supporting the leg? Is it part of the chair? Is it a towel? It looks very similar to the beach blanket, beach towel on the left, because it's the same pattern. Does it connect to those shapes behind the chair? That's kind of my intention, but I think it works almost as both, and you allow the viewer to kind of make that call. So when there's room for ambiguity, I'm game for it. Make your clear shapes really sell the story, and then give it a little art. Allow some ambiguity. Let the viewer be engaged in it and be part of the process. And here I'm just playing around with little shapes. The whole piece is basically done, and these little moments just kind of complete alignments, complete shape relationships with other things, maybe balance things out a little. Seeing if that value on that side plane needs to be darker, and I just made it darker because it needed that contrast. I've already set up sort of that light and shadow relationship elsewhere, so I wanted to solidify it. Experimenting, wondering if that ball needs a cast shadow. I didn't really like it because it sort of defeated that negative space and figure ground relationship, so it ultimately goes away. But what did the sandals look like on the left side? What does that weird shape there on that ground do? Can I cover it up? Can I rip it off? Trial and error. Rip it off. It's got a nice little white edge there. Repeats what's happening on the left side. And I'm moving that little white piece around, and there's almost like this, it almost fits in that spot there. Gives me a moment of small scale versus large scale on both sides of the picture to kind of balance the sandals out as well. And this little piece is just feathering the value change out. It brightens it up a little bit, softens it. And looking at what would happen on that side. Do I need something over there? Is that shape that comes out away from the ice chest too strong? What's it look like in the background? Oh, but that one's much better. It's darker. So I like that. Bring some of the same color of the foreground into the background. And again, I'm looking at areas that, well, in collage, they're hard shapes, but can you soften it with the value change? So it's a really strong dark underneath that umbrella. And I think I ultimately find something just a little bit brighter. That's too bright though. That's much better though, right? So I'm clipping it out, cutting it out, and you can see it positioned in there. And then this is like the final touches. Just another moment of higher saturation orange there to hold the foreground. Some sort of detail on the blanket. And that'll really do it. We're going to zoom in, see a good close-up and a scan of it. And I really hope you enjoy this and have some fun playing with collage. Thank you, everyone.